bomb being dropped. So who wishes to start?
I will start. So the Pacific War, which obviously led up to this blockade of Japan that we saw right before the bomb, saw a lot of like island hopping. We'd go from one island to another, and sometimes it was really costly. Like for instance, I think the Battle of Iwo Jima, the Japanese lost about 25,000, but we had about 25,000 casualties as well. So we're taking heavy losses, even as we're scoring great victories against Japan through this strategy.
Yeah, I mean, firebombing had killed 100,000 people in Tokyo alone with no discernible political effect. So yeah, I agree that the bomb really kind of put an end to that. And yeah.
I agree that it put an end to it, but I think that because of the fact that the Soviets weren't helping us anymore, and it was basically between us and Japan, and any other form of attack or form of strategy against Japan essentially would have led to more casualties between the United States and Japan than it would override the amount of casualties that we had within the two attacks of the atomic bomb.
And I'd also like to point out the fight till you die culture of Japan at the time. It didn't seem like we're going to win the war, and basically, it wasn't going to look close. And if we keep on, making all these casualties, then we keep losing casualties. They keep losing casualties. It's just that,
Yeah, the Japanese people were basically committing mass suicides when they were caught. Like they would be refused to be taken as POWs. And I just want to bring up the point that Truman had just come into presidency, and FDR had recently passed, and I think Japan saw that as a sign of weakness. So I don't think they were close to surrendering.
Well, also it says in the reading that Japan, the U.S. Gave Japan an offer to surrender and said they had a weapon of mass destruction, and Japan just sort of blew it off. So they were.
I think that going along with that, I think that the United States was between what Bernie just said and giving the Japan a chance to surrender, and before they actually attacked with the atomic bombs, they dropped pamphlets down for the civilians, warning them to flee, not exactly telling them that they're going to drop an atomic bomb and destroy everything they've ever seen. But they did warn them and encourage them to flee and to leave.
Yeah, I feel like if pamphlets dropped from the sky telling me to leave, I would probably leave.
Yeah. The thing is, the Japanese had no idea that we were doing something as monumental as an atomic bomb. This was a very well-kept secret, like the documentary talked about. They didn't even know the target they were going to bomb until basically right before they took off. This was top secret. The Japanese didn't know. Most of the United States didn't know.
I don't think Truman knew
Until FDR died.
I don't think anybody
Probably
really
not.
knew. Even the people who planned it, created it, came up with it,
It's
nobody
not-
knew what was going to happen.
What do you mean by
It's not like-
monumental?
Well, monumental as in just the sheer power of the device, the bomb, and the effects, the political effects that it had. It wasn't just a massive explosion. It was in some ways a political explosion in the way that it rocked the world, that it rocked Japan, that it rocked, frankly, even the United States.
It was a statement.
Yes, indeed, it did change the world in an entire different way. I was just trying to discern whether or not your opinion on it was a good or a bad thing. I was confused.
Yeah, but let's steer.
Let's go back to more what led up
We
to
got
it.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
we've kind of.
Because
steered-
we'll get to that
Yeah.
eventually.
Okay.
Don't worry about it. We're gonna hit that.
Yeah, so I mean, island hopping was definitely a major aspect that led up to it, and the major amount of deaths. The Japanese culture, the fight till you die idea, kind of was shown on a large scale with the use of the atomic bomb. Yeah.
I also feel like the atomic bomb was also, the intimidation tactic, try to, get them away from that fight or die culture. Because either way, we probably would have bombed the cities anyway. But the fact that, we had this weapon of mass destruction, we kind of, say, hey, don't mess with us, or, you'll have a bad time.
I'm sorry, I was just confused when you guys were talking about the fight or die moment of the Japanese culture. Are we trying to validate here that it was a perfect excuse anyway to just let them all die anyway? And I know we are talking about leading up to the point, but it does kind of lead up to the point, because concerning of our opinions regarding the culture, would it just have us validate, made us have that opinion and decision to finally come to the conclusion that we should just bomb them?
Well, like there was a lot of things.
Yeah, let's let Rashida speak.
I was trying to add to Amy's point, but like people need to understand like the caliber that an atomic bomb has. Like it will literally destroy everything. And in that process, yeah, I guess they like dropped pamphlets to warn the citizens that this was happening, but I don't think that's enough. And like you killed so many civilians in this, and I guess for a good cause we did kind of stop the Japanese. But at the same time, is it really worth it? Because we killed so many people, and
And the Japanese didn't really treat their civilians.
Yeah.
Sorry to do this again. We have to steer kind of back
We
to
will
the
get to
build-up,
this.
But we'll take a
I
hard look
promise
at that.
you.
Well, it's like kind of all connected in a way.
Well, yeah, but there's
There's
other
a
there's
specific
other
way
ways.
this has been
It's
done.
the topics versus
I'm
the
sorry.
topics.
We spoke with him in the morning, and he said Mr. Fallon said that he had a few specific questions that he wanted us to answer, and part of it was what led to the bomb being dropped, like what was happening at the time to make them, make this mass decision. And
Yeah,
this was huge.
I think that summarizing what we've had so far, I mean, I think island hopping was, I think everybody can agree that was the biggest lead up. And it was the bloody war. No matter what was gonna happen, there's always a lead up, there's the war itself, the ending of the war, the aftermath. No matter what part of the war you're talking about, leading up to it, there had to be something there.
Yes.
So many people had already died, but I think Japan saw the United States as a weaker individual after FDR had died. I think they saw them less as a threat, and I think this bomb kind of set that precedent, you will not mess with us.
I agree with that, especially after FDR died, and Japan truly did not think that Truman had it in him to attack anything.
Yeah.
They didn't think he was prepared, or he was informed. They didn't think he would do it.
Also, these with the island hoppings, the U.S. was losing thousands upon thousands of troops to get these little 14 square mile pieces of land. Iwo Jima was extremely small, but it took months of fighting and thousands of lives. So it must have really felt like they weren't making as much progress as they did.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's the major contribution to the build-up, or not the contribution to the build-up, contribution to the decision to drop a bomb. Because I mean, it's just the question is it worth it? And I mean, that's kind of does pertain to the build-up, because it was just an idea of should we do it, and that was just part of the build-up.
And speaking to the island hopping culture, the island hopping warfare, and a bit about the fight to the death culture, I think yes, we were losing many soldiers per unit of land mass, but it wasn't so much the land mass, but the control over the sea and the air that owning that land mass represented, and that's hard to quantify. But even these islands, even though they're tiny, they're thousands of miles apart. So we take Midway, and we take Iwo Jima, and the Philippines, for instance. The only time we get into warfare that moves along the land is MacArthur's forces in the Philippines, in that area of Southeast Asia.
And this strategy was beneficial when it started. We were, easily attacking Japan spots where, they weren't as heavily defended. But as we kept going with the strategy, getting closer and closer to the main island, we, didn't expect, so they would get tougher and tougher as we got farther and farther. So the strategic advantages of, getting closer and closer to the island through island hopping got less and less as we kept going through.
Also to that point, I remember in one of the videos that we watched, it said, as they started to get closer to the island, the Japanese felt like they started to fight harder, and that's why they developed like the earlier points we were talking about, like the do or die, or like the dying.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't something that's covered in the video or anything, but I would imagine that part of the reason we were driven to use the bomb was that we were scared of this fight to the death kind of thing, because we knew. They talked about it. I think, a little bit in one of the videos or something, that we had this whole plan to storm the beaches of Japan.
Yeah.
And I think we were not. Obviously, we weren't there. The United States soldiers and military command were scared that if you land on the beaches, not only do you have to worry about getting into the mainland, what are the people going to do when you get there?
I think that's fair to say, Ben. I mean, I'm sure that I agree 100% that they were scared, because as they were island hopping, I'm sure they expected it to get harder as you get closer to the main enemy, but I'm sure as you start out and you're winning and you're like gaining momentum and you're feeling good and you're winning and you continue to win, of course you're going to lose people on the way, but they're still winning and they're carrying the war. I'm sure that it hit them hard to see how hard it got, so close that they got. And when they got to the big island, as hard as it was at the time, as many people as they were losing, I'm sure they weren't ready, and they didn't feel satisfied with how it was going, and it was too late. So I'm sure they were scared. They needed something big.
Yeah, maybe we misinterpreted how far, how much harder they would fight as we got closer and closer. Because I feel like maybe the original plan, as we did get closer, it's kind of like start panicking, because now we have all these strategic sites to come at them. But, as we, again, it turned out to be the opposite, and they're like, okay, that plan failed, what's next? And that's kind of, what led us, okay, maybe, the atomic bomb, that might be the next route to go.
I think we also just have to remember that, attitude toward Japan at that time was not great.
Yeah.
They had just come in and bombed Pearl Harbor and killed thousands and thousands of people. And I think the American people saw that and they were like, go ahead, bomb them. Because I think the mentality at that time was all is fair in war, because a lot of these countries were falling into extreme poverty, and you saw millions dying in concentration camps.
I think the mentality of the Americans then, when they were fighting the Japanese, they were more focused on the effects of the white Americans. Obviously, we can all agree on that, really, because
I also have to bring up the point that when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, they were thinking about the good of themselves. So
same as we did.
Yeah, but it goes both ways, and
It does, but there is a major difference in the bombing and
it was
killing.
instigated.
Sure, and I think not to say that, obviously there were racial, maybe not racial things, driving factors, definitely racial undertones across the U.S. military. You look at propaganda of the era, it uses words we now consider slurs against Japanese people. Mm-hmm. You can look at that, you can't deny that. When you also look at, and this is kind of building off of other knowledge I have, the attitude that the Japanese, just want to score some points, Mr. Fallon. the attitude that the Japanese have about race, they view themselves as a race, and they view themselves as superior to the people of China, of Southeast Asia, of Korea.
That is very true.
So it does go both ways with the race.
The mentality, yeah.
It is a mentality.
Also, before the bomb was dropped, they were making decisions on what they should actually do, because where they should actually put it, because they only had 2 bombs, I'm pretty sure, and they had to pick very strategically where to put them. Yeah. And that's, I think, also another reason why they chose cities and not to do it on waterways, because if they did it on waterways, they essentially thought they were wasting bombs.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
Yeah, and in Hiroshima, it was kind of like a combination of both. It had a couple major rivers running through it. I'm not sure how many or what specific rivers, but yeah.
Alright, so I think we have covered that enough, and I think we can just move on to this point of what happened. You know, like
Yeah.
what were like the final moments leading up to the bomb being dropped, and what happened when the bomb was dropped.
I mean, I found it interesting how when you watch the video and when you see them in the plane and you see how they recreate it and how there's few men who are actually in charge of the bomb while it's in the plane. They have to go there. They have to, for example, take up the green pins and put in the red pins. And it's really putting a lot of responsibility on very few people, which
Yeah.
I feel in the aftermath, which I know we're gonna get to later.
I think
but
they
feel
didn't
like
realize
that
what
was a lot.
responsibility they hold bombing like
No,
that.
I don't think they.
I
do
think
not think they realized
did
what
not
it was
realize
going
what
to do.
was
Yeah.
going to happen.
I don't think most people around that operation were
Yeah.
informed of basically what they had their holds on. Like
I
that's was one of the biggest weapons in the world at the time, and I don't think anyone had any knowledge as
Yes,
to.
it killed like 90% of the population and
Yeah.
affecting the rest with radiation, and now it's still affecting generations.
But yeah, it,
That's
the,
part of the aftermath.
Yeah.
the pilots of the I forget what plane it was that flew over Nagasaki, they definitely knew what was going on.
They did, but I think the ships that transported a lot of the bombs,
Yeah.
like there were very few people on that ship,
Yeah,
like,
it's
probably
really-
close to 5 that had any idea as to what it actually was.
Yeah, looked like Indianapolis.
Yes.
Yeah. Like in the book, In Harm's Way, they only the people on the boats who were transporting these didn't even know what they were. They just knew them. They were a certain cargo that had to get somewhere.
Yeah, it was 2 engineers. And you listen to these scientists, Robert Oppenheimer, McNamara, that worked on, I'm sorry, gotta be a nerd here, that worked on the atomic bomb project. I don't remember the name of the operation. And they talk about Manhattan Project. And they talk about kind of, I don't know, didn't get maximum history nerd cred. And they talk about it like they're horrified. Like you listen to Oppenheimer say like, I thought like, I have become death, destroyer of worlds. And they were horrified.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, they tested these bombs beforehand, but they never tested on like an actual city. Like they were testing out in the desert,
Yeah.
but they never like realized like how much of an effect it would have on a civilization.
Well, I think that's
I don't
fair.
think they probably just didn't. I think they were just, because of that irresponsibility, I just think they just didn't have enough care.
I think that irresponsibility, I'm not sure that would be the correct term.
No,
because
yeah.
I feel that
Yes.
nobody knew it was going to happen. Nobody's ever done it before. We were
If we
losing
didn't
people
know what was going to happen, why did we do it in the first place?
because we were losing so many
Yeah.
people, and war is war. As terrible as it is to say, no matter what strategy we use to
But
win this
the goal
war,
is
not
people
war.
would have died.
Okay, good.
Well-
Let her finish. Which did you-
War, are you trying to say war validates killing these civilians?
Yes.
Well, okay, so
That is genocide.
but total war, which is the strategy of total destruction to win the war, includes civilians, and it's not
Yeah.
only from the United States to Japan.
Japan
Ask people from
Japan
Pearl Harbor.
already had cities already crushed,
but-
and they were so close.
But so did the United States. Ask people from Pearl Harbor. Japan came and they bombed Pearl Harbor, which was vastly populated by civilians who were killed.
Another thing,
It's not fair to say that we
They
don't
were
Can
looking.
we look at you?
a majority of the population in Pearl Harbor was Japanese too, so when they dropped bombs, they were also killing their own kind.
Yeah.
I think
It was.
important
It
to know.
became clear very quickly that it wasn't only the United States that had.
Well,
the
I'm not
intention of
trying to
mass
validate that the destruction Japan has caused is not as equally terrible as the United States, because we all know Japan was really, really crazy, a lot of rape and a lot of killing all over Asia, all that imperialism, all that colonizing, taking all over. Basically, they were trying to do basically like what the Nazis wanted to do,
They were very.
want to build an empire.
And I do believe that, you know, the hostility that Americans had towards the Japanese for doing those things that you said did, you know, take in part in why, you know, we decided to use this weapon. Because I know there was hostility, racial and you know, nationalistic hostility to both sides, and I believe that did play a major role.
But it's because it's just the bombs obviously are very, very different, and the aftermaths are very, very different.
Yeah, I think that is true. Is comparing two bombings, like say the bombing of Dresden in Germany was a firebombing, similar to what you saw in these Japanese cities. But that was par for the course in Europe and in Asia. I mean, yes, it was destruction, it was death, it was horror, but in war, in this kind of warfare, destruction of cities by firebombs was par for the course. What we saw, and I think we mentioned this, was just jolting them into seeing the United States is more powerful than they can imagine. They don't stand a chance.
Well, I understand that destruction and violence is needed in war, and I just think that the imperialism Japan has got, America also has.
Yes, well, definitely.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I want to ask this question, and it's not a personal attack, but like, no, like seriously.
Like
Mr. Fallon, I apologize. We lost about 5 minutes of footage, but we're gonna quickly summarize some of the points that we made and go right into the third point about if it is justified or not. We're gonna have. You start.
So I'm sort of on the fence about this because I'm leaning slightly towards, I feel like it shouldn't have been dropped. I don't think there was enough justification, but I can see points about how it was justified, as Dory made points about how war is war and stuff happens, even though it's hard to admit. But when you read like the testimonies about like these families who suffered, like it is heartbreaking to read through, and I feel like we tend to forget that these are people, and these are real people with real lives who have suffered through this, and that's just kind of how I feel about it.
I do feel that it was it did cause a lot of suffering and, infrastructure damage and human damage across Japan for a long time. And that, I would have preferred if it wasn't dropped, but I feel that at the time, for the people, who are viewing, Japanese as these horrible people and, had just this hatred, I feel like it was the only choice they could make at the time. But looking back on it now, I feel like, there could have been other routes that they could have taken that, may have caused, a longer and bloodier war, but, wouldn't have ended with as many long effects as it did.
Alright, so I'm gonna have to go with that. I think that the bomb being dropped was very much justified. I think that everything that had led up to it, including Pearl Harbor, and then just all the other events going on, there was so much happening at once, and there wasn't time to account for all of it. And I think that at the time people were thinking with their emotions. I think a lot of people let their emotions get the best of them, and that's what led to this bomb being dropped. And of course you have to feel bad for, the entire cities that were almost completely wiped out. But at the same time, I think that all is fair in war, and that, people were fighting to the death either way. And that was the only way to go in a lot of people's minds. So.
I just want to be clear. I hate nuclear weapons. I wish that they didn't exist. I think the bombings were horrifying. The big however is that you look at civilian casualties versus what happened in the bombing, which was around 100,000. But if you compare that to what could have happened if Operation Downfall had continued, it's impossible to know. Many Japanese big cities are on the coasts. They may end up being close to targets for United States landings. The United States was amassing the biggest force ever it had ever amassed. And that entire military power crashing against the shores of Japan could have killed perhaps hundreds of thousands more civilians than were killed by the bombs. The unfortunate, my view of it is that the citizens of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they had the extremely unfortunate situation of being the sacrifice that was made so that the rest of Japan could survive without worse damage than had already been inflicted on it.
I think that it's safe to say that nobody, Japanese or American, is proud of the amount of people that died. Nobody's happy that this amount of people died. Nobody expected that this amount of people would die. But I think that going into the war, it's safe to say that war is war. Whether it happened with this many casualties in Japan or this amount of casualties in the United States, all of the buildup with the amount of deaths, I think that there had to be something big. The war had to end, and I think that whether or not it was used with this atomic bomb, if they used any other strategies, they made it longer, they kept using fire bombs, they kept doing other things, the amount of casualties would have either been similar or they would have been larger than the amount with the atomic bomb. I also think that it's not fair to claim that it was 100% purposeful, because going into the bombing, nobody knew what the bomb was. Nobody knew what was going to happen. Nobody's ever tested the bomb. Nobody's ever seen a weapon like this, and they dropped it not knowing what it was going to do, and it destroyed, and it essentially ended the war. As many problems as it caused continuing in the future, something had to have been done, and nobody would have known what was going to happen in the future after it happened. But if it didn't happen with us to Japan, it would have happened to Japan to us. So something had to have been done to end the war.
So I agree with the first bomb being dropped, but I do not agree with the second one being dropped, because the first bomb was dropped on August 6th, and then the second on August 9th. So there was not sufficient time for the Japanese to consider or to get a surrender statement really out and to like say, hey, we're done, we're not gonna fight anymore, before the second bomb was dropped. And like from the second bomb, roughly like it's like hard to say, but 39 to 80,000 people died in the second bombing, which that bombing I don't think was as justified. If it had been like weeks, maybe, but like they had no time to actually really surrender. And the first bomb basically would have put them into submission. So like,
yeah, I mean, I think it's like very impossible to predict long-term history, and it's really just kind of what occurred. I think, and it's kind of a gamble with like a slight prediction of the future, because you know the atomic bomb has never been dropped before Hiroshima, and it's really hard to predict what's going to happen to the economy, what's going to happen to like the health effects, what's going to happen to the environment, and it's never actually been tested on an actual community and city. So it's really just kind of what political leaders would think would happen if it did drop and if it didn't drop. And so we obviously do know what did happen as it did drop, and it did drastically change history. So what we can slightly like kind of predict based off of history beforehand, what would happen if Operation Downfall had continued, like Mitchell said. And also, I really agree with the way he said it. It's a sacrifice, and to put the end to World War II. But not only that, just to future history. What would happen if an atomic bomb were dropped again? And I think that really kind of comes up again in the Cold War, because it would have definitely changed the Cold War in my opinion. Yeah, so I believe it was justified.
May I proceed?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I'm like in Judy mode, sorry. I was thinking, I was like, honor, may I proceed? I do not believe the bombing was not justified. It was very inhumane, we agree on all of that. the effects were done to the civilians, the environment, just everything, the state of Japan. It was a lot. And I think if the US really didn't know what they were doing, I feel like the alternative was to test on an unpopulated site or change the location somewhere in Japan. I feel like they could have done that, at least at the most. And I understand that there are a lot of measures to be done with war, but is it really worth it with the atomic bomb just to end the war, killing so many civilians, and the aftermath? Is it really? And I think Operation Downfall, maybe if we just really waited on the Soviets. Just maybe if we really waited on the Soviets, things could change. I feel like there could have been other alternatives than deciding on something we didn't know what was capable of. I know that no one knew what was going to happen with it, but really, if we didn't know what was going to happen with it, why would we just throw it on the field for the first try? I mean, you don't just send an amateur baseball player out in the pros. I don't know stuff about baseball, but that's not good. But that's what I thought, and I don't think it's right.
Okay, so I think that we should.
I believe we all actually answered the third point, which was was it justified?
That's what
So
we were
I
doing.
feel
Yeah, that's what we were doing just
I feel like that's like a healthy discussion. I feel like we should move on to after effects
Yes.
and how it affected today. Because
Yeah.
we're well over half an hour.
What
Not
time
gonna
is it?
lie.
Sorry, Mr. Phone.
15
Sorry,
minutes.
Miss
Yeah,
Sandra.
sorry, Miss Sandra.
Yeah, Sammy needs to go to sleep, Mr. Fallon.
It's 11:45.
It's currently 11:45. You're welcome.
we spend more time reading essays anyway, so.
Yeah. I mean, you're not wrong.
I would spend more time writing an essay.
Alright, so what's next?
Alright,
Exactly.
so
That's
After
kind of
effects.
related to what?
Well,
what
obviously for after effects like health issues.
oh yeah, the health issues.
Cancer went up tremendously. You know, people had leukemia, and obviously being exposed to massive amounts of radiation isn't good because it can lead to birth defects in children, among like other diseases. But yeah, I think just health-wise that was a big thing. And also, I'm not sure, but I don't know if like in the Geneva Convention they adapted and added something about aerial bombing and how it would be technically considered a war crime after World War II. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but it says international law since 1945, so I'm guessing they probably changed it after the atomic bomb was dropped to include aerial bombing as a war crime. But that's something that changed.
I think that everyone here has read Unbroken, right?
Yeah.
In English, so we've all seen some sort of the.
I cheated.
Oh.
Don't tell Mr.
Don't tell
Caulfield.
Two teachers, Amy, two.
We're not cutting that one.
But
I
we.
meant like cheating by reading the book.
Oh, okay.
No, I
What?
didn't cheat on the test.
Okay,
Come
anyways,
on.
people.
Continue.
We so we've all seen a certain level of PTSD and the after effects of the war, not necessarily on the Japanese, but on Americans, which I think is a big point to bring up, that it not only affected the people it killed, it affected everybody. The people who fought, the people who were killed, the people who survived, the families, people who weren't involved at all. It changed life for everyone and everywhere. It was a world-changing event, and I think that it was something to learn from. But I think that everyone was affected.
Yeah, I know.
No, I wasn't talking directly to you.
I know
was
you
just
were looking at me. I was like, Dory, where are you looking at me?
Yeah, I definitely feel like, while the bomb did devastate, the land itself, it also devastated the society that came with it. Like, people who either survived the bomb or had families or friends who were lost in the bomb, their whole lives were obviously changed. And, they will never feel that same way again. And this isn't just like one time. This is an entire region of Japan that has gone through so much dread and so much sad. Like PTSD is like skyrocketed, obviously, because of this, and I just feel as though that was probably one of the bigger ones, because I feel like that part of the after effects still affects families today.
Can I go ahead and hear you? Okay.
Just kind of referring to my notes on this one. Referring to my notes on this one, as I said, the article talks about the 3 kind of immediate effects, which is not psychological. You're talking about psychological.
Yes.
I mean like medical, health, and talked about the immediate effects, the long run, and future generations. And there are various immediate effects. I mean, it talks about things like vomiting, short-term radiation poisoning, which would be confined obviously only to the people that were there, and then after that you'd think they'd be gone. But this study found that people had an increase in cancer, and that their children had an increase in birth defects and cancer and all of these things. So it goes beyond just the individual. Yes, it was a relatively small part of the population, but the effects were lasting. There are probably people that are still suffering from defects or something because of that.
Alright, just to
Oh, but-
Oh, sorry.
Didn't we just see that? I don't know what that was, but I think it's like an animal.
the hotel's
Why would
haunted, by
you
the
say
way.
that?
Yeah.
Can somebody make sure that's still recorded?
Guys, focus.
Alright,
Can we make sure there's still
So-
recorded?
It's still going.
Effects on today. I think that people and countries have just taken a look around at what happened to Japan, and I think that's why we have not gone into another nuclear war yet, because with the effects of Japan, while they were horrible, I think it's not lucky or good, but I think the way it happened has deterred everyone from going into nuclear war on a large scale and absolutely devastating the planet.
I also feel like this kind of sets up the Cold War between America and Russia, where they were in a stalemate for so many years, because if this kind of taught them, if one side attacks, both sides are going to be utterly destroyed. So I feel like it's an important date in history because it kind of it's looked back on as an important date in history because people actually learned how deadly these things can be.
Yeah, I mean, I think good. There's bad things, obviously, the deaths, the side effects. But I think one thing that I can show as a good thing is that kind of know what happens when a bomb is dropped, and it came with a heavy price, obviously, but is it worth that price? And that's just something that's really hard to predict, and that it really comes up in the Cold War, yeah, definitely, because if it hadn't, if world leaders knew of the effects that it did have, or didn't know the effects that it did have, would they have gone as far as to actually drop another bomb or launch another missile, not another missile, but a missile to the Soviet Union or the United States? And
What?
talking about the Cold War.
Oh, sorry, I was so confused. I was like, what?
Yeah.
I think
Yeah, so I just think that it may have helped prevent a missile launch from the Soviet Union or the United States, as they were so close from actually launching a missile. And I don't know, maybe if the bomb was never dropped, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb were never dropped, maybe it's neither, maybe no missiles would be launched in the Cold War. It's really hard to predict.
I think we should start to wrap up. Does anyone have any final thoughts?
I just think. Oh, sorry, Mitchell. No, Mitchell, you start first. Mitchell. No, Mitchell, you start first.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, Amy, just you can, if you have an opinion, then you can
Amy,
give
just
it.
go.
I like
Okay,
that.
it's just a final thought. It's just my mortality is I prefer human life over
Your mortality.
whatever.
Your mentality.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Yeah, it is mortals.
It's
no.
midnight, Mr. Powell.
I don't know what it's called.
What's your mentality?
No, it's not.
Okay, it doesn't matter.
Morally.
Amy, just go.
Morality.
Morality. That's
Alright, go
my,
on.
my morality
Go on.
is I prefer human life over everything else.
That's fair.
I'm gonna, if everyone's okay with that, I'm gonna like a big spacey philosophical note.
Are you getting those extra credits?
Okay, bye, Mr. Fallon. It's midnight.
Nuclear weapons are not going away. Our memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is. What happens if that memory is gone? Will the nukes fly? Catch us next time.
I actually,